Good evening, everyone. I'm Amanda Thurman, Chair of the Parent Involvement Committee. I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's parent engagement session. Unfortunately, I am unable to join you live, but I am busy working with an amazing group of boys that I coach to prepare them as they represent the Lancaster Bombers and City of Hamilton at this weekend's Ontario Minor Hockey Association Provincial Championships. I hope everyone finds tonight's session informative and helpful as we all play an important role in helping children be successful in their education and life journey. At this point, I would like to welcome Dawn Dangle, Chair of the Board of Trustees, to say a few words.
Good evening. My name is Dawn Dangle, and I'm the Chair of the Hamilton-Wentworth District School Board. On behalf of the Board of Trustees, it is my privilege to welcome you to this evening's virtual session. I would like to thank the Parent Involvement Committee for their ongoing work to organize and host sessions like this one to engage families in understanding how we can best support our students at HWDSB. I also appreciate the focus of tonight's session on human rights and equity. As we know, our commitment to equity has to be an ongoing journey of learning and unlearning. I also want to thank staff who've supported the session this evening, and I hope you will enjoy the event.
Thank you, Dawn. Now, I would like to welcome Paul Denemy, Superintendent of Equity and Student Engagement, who will introduce tonight's presenters.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Paul Denemy, and I am Superintendent of Student Achievement with the portfolios of Equity and Student Engagement. And we are very excited to be here tonight and being asked to bring this presentation forward by our PIC committee. I'd like to begin tonight, so if I just ask to turn the slide, I'd like to begin tonight with the land acknowledgement. The Hamilton-Wentworth District School Board acknowledges our presence on ancestral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee Confederacy land as determined by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. The intent of this agreement is for all nations sharing this territory to do so responsibly, respectfully, and sustainably in perpetuity. We respect the long-standing relationships with the local Indigenous communities, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and the Six Nations of the Grand River. Next slide, please. Just want to review the agenda tonight before I introduce the team for you. We'll begin by our welcome and an introduction, the land acknowledgements. We'll then going to move into some presentation around Human Rights Office and the Equity Department and what each of those responsibilities lie. We're then going to talk about human rights resolution process. We'll get an introduction to what equity at HWDSB is and what it does. And then we're going to be having a conversation around CRRP. And then at that time, we'll be taking questions on any of the topics that we have produced tonight. Knowing when we enter the question area that equity and human rights is a huge and vast area, we will be focusing questions, though, that are pertaining directly to the information that we are presenting tonight. Before we move any further, I would love to introduce the team that we have with us tonight. Johanna Otete, our Human Resources Officer, our Human Rights Officer, was not able to be with us tonight. But I would like to start by introducing Michelle Rodney Bartolos, the Assistant Principal of Equity within HWDSB. Muna Bile, she is a Human Rights Officer with HWDSB. I would like to introduce Saja Stiller, who is our Safe Schools consultant. Connie Sun, who is one of our program consultants. And then we have a number of people, oh, there's Connie, thanks. And then we have a number of people behind the scenes. A huge thanks to Kim, Nick, Sharon, and Sean McKillop for making this all work so seamlessly. Next slide, please. We really want to nest in the why, the why we have such a focus on human rights and equity within HWDSB. And the Ontario education system has been recognized internationally for improved outcomes in the past few years in terms of student achievement. However, these successes have not provided for equitable outcomes for all students. Persistent inequalities or inequities, achievement, and opportunity gaps continue to exist, impacting students' well-being and their lives negatively. Specifically, there is ample evidence that some groups of students are underserved in the education system. These include students that identify as Indigenous, Black, racialized, Two-Spirit, LGBTQIA+, students with disabilities, and student and special education needs, and students from low socioeconomic backgrounds. Systematic barriers and discriminatory practices that contribute to disparities and disproportionalities in the education system need to be identified and addressed in order to serve all students equitably. We need to create working and learning environments that reflect the diversity of our students and our population. All students and staff have the right to learn and work in an environment where they are safe, supported, and accepted, and where their human rights is respected and fulfilled. This means there is an urgent need to consistently identify and address inequities at all levels of our organization systems, schools, and our classrooms. Next slide, please.
So I'll jump in here and talk about the how. The how HWDSB is addressing equity within schools. So how do we achieve a vision of equity for all, not only for students, but staff as well? HWDSB's vision is laid out in the Equity Action Plan, which is a document which serves as a roadmap to proactively identify and address discriminatory practices and systemic barriers. The action plan identifying and addressing equity issues has 4 different areas: schools and classrooms, leadership, governance, and human resources, positive culture and well-being, as well as data collection, integration, and reporting. We invite you to go onto the HWDSB website and familiarize yourself with this work and find out ways that you can create alignment in your own role as a parent, or if you're an educator or a student joining us tonight. Next slide, please. So who is responsible for carrying out this Equity Action Plan? Who is responsible to ensure that our vision of equity is realized? The answer is, really, we all have a responsibility. Every employee, every student, every staff member, every parent has a role and responsibility to ensure that HWDSB learning and working environments are free from discrimination, harassment, and that they contribute to the mission of empowering students to learn and grow to their full potential in a diverse world. We know that teachers are responsible for preparing lesson plans and teaching classes and encouraging students in their studies and evaluating student work in progress. Teachers, as well as administrators, help with supervising students and managing classroom discipline. We all work towards equity in schools, meaning that we examine systems, policies, and practices that produce inequitable outcomes. Learn more, as I said, about our Equity Action Plan by visiting the full document on the board website. Next slide, please. The structures that we have in place to create the positive culture and well-being part of the Equity Action Plan involves many different departments working together. We have the Human Rights Department, the Equity Department, Safe Schools Department, Mental Health and Wellbeing Department, our Indigenous Education Department, Specialized Services, Human Resources, as well as program and curriculum departments. All these departments contribute to a positive culture and well-being of our students, and each department plays a very specific role in making sure that we achieve the goals of our Equity Action Plan. Next slide, please.
So we're going to start by breaking down and digging a little bit deeper into the equity department that Michelle and I both are privileged to lead. And really, we are working with staff, students, and community partners to advance equity through inclusive policies, programming, and services. We're providing guidance to build capacity to implement the Equity Action Plan at different levels, build awareness and accountability on equity-related issues. Our department has grown over the last number of years. So as a superintendent assigned to equity, we have assistant principal Michelle that you've already met that is responsible for equity. We have 3 consultants that work within our team that are supporting schools, supporting resources to support curriculum, that support students within the schools. We work closely with two of our social work team that support racialized and Two-Spirit LGBTQIA+ students and guide on creating safe and inclusive environments within this department. So as the department continues to grow, we continue to look on how to embed equity into all areas and strengthen our commitment to equity and work closely with community partners, student voice, and parents and community. Next slide, please. Digging into a little bit deeper in what we do, and I think that this graph demonstrates the areas that we are really trying to work and influence directly. So if we go to the smallest circle, I want to begin there, and that's really the instructional core. That's what students should be learning, their assignments, the instruction that they receive every day. So we're really working, and you're going to learn more about this with our presentation with Saja and Connie in a few minutes, is really that culturally relevant and responsive instructional core. And how are we knowing our students, and how are we responding to their diverse needs and their diverse identities? The second area that we work to influence is gap closing through intentional supports and partnerships. And examples here are our graduation coaches for Black students, where we have 3 within our system, currently serving in 4 schools. This is student voice groups that intentionally target and support and hear voice from racialized students or Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA+ students, or focusing on various areas that we need to continue to support and eliminate barriers and close gaps. From there, if we move one circle out, we focus on capacity building and supporting the capacity building throughout the system, whether that's learning for executive council, principals and vice principals throughout the system, supporting principals in leading professional development days. For example, our last professional development day was on March the 4th, and we focused on culturally relevant and responsive pedagogies throughout the system. And then the foundation of all of it is that largest green circle that you see in front of you. And that's really that human rights, anti-racism, anti-oppression foundation, and looking through all of these things through that lens and doing better around human rights, anti-racism and anti-oppression work, and ensuring that that is weaved throughout our system and that we understand our human rights and how to look through things through an anti-racist, anti-oppression framework. Next slide, please. And I believe I'm turning it to Muna to review the Human Rights Office.
Thank you very much, Paul. Hello, everyone. My name is Muna Bile, and I am the Human Rights Early Resolution Supervisor at the Human Rights Office, along with my colleague, Johanna Otite, who is the Human Rights and Equity Officer. And so what do we do at the Human Rights Office? Well, we are another resource that is available for staff and students and families. The office works towards building and maintaining a culture of human rights, and we do this through learning and awareness building to protect and promote principles of human rights among students, staff, families, and really all of HWDSB stakeholders. We also review policies and practices to ensure that HWDSB's learning and working spaces are free from discrimination and harassment. And finally, we resolve human rights concerns and complaints through fair, timely process that focuses on early resolution and culturally responsive restorative justice approaches. Next slide, please. And so there are certain concepts that we have to identify. The first being discrimination. So the Human Rights Office focuses on identifying and addressing human rights code related to discrimination and harassment. But what do we mean by discrimination? Discrimination is an action or decision that treats a person or a group unfairly or negatively for reasons such as their race, gender, religion, disability, age, or other protected grounds. Discrimination can be direct or indirect, individual or systemic, and need not be intended. So it's important to know here that the intent is not necessary. It is irrelevant. It also includes hate activity occurring in learning or working environments. Sometimes a rule or practice unintentionally singles out a group of people and results in unequal treatment. This type of unintentional discrimination is called constructive discrimination. Next slide, please. So another key term here is harassment, which is a form of discrimination. Essentially, it is an unwelcome pattern of behavior that offends or humiliates people because of their characteristics. It can be something someone says, how they touch you, how they ignore or isolate you, or something they write down or a drawing they share. Some examples of harassment are name calling, unwanted remarks, jokes, slurs, displaying derogatory or offensive messages, failure to accommodate, curriculum material that promotes discrimination, and so on. Another example of discrimination, for instance, is not being properly accommodated, whether you're in the classroom or in the playground. So for such concerns, we ask you to please contact your school principal and/or the Human Rights Office. Next slide, please. So currently, what can families do if they have a human rights concerns? There are 3 paths that families can take. The first being an informal resolution. This is when parties decide to resolve an issue or a problem with or without the help of a trusted adult, without involving the school. There's also school-based resolution, which is available, and this is when folks either report to the principal, who will investigate the issue and decide on next steps. In this case, the principal can decide to seek the support of the Human Rights Office. The third option is a formal resolution. This situation isn't resolved. If the situation isn't resolved at the school level, they can contact the superintendent office or directly the Human Rights Office by filling an intake form. But it is important to remember that at any point, whether a staff, a student, any stakeholder has a concern, a complaint, they can directly come and connect with the Human Rights Office to seek support. Finally, they can also, at any point in these steps, file a complaint with the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. Next slide, please. On your screen, you should be able to see the contact information for the equity team or the Human Rights Office. For more information, here are the contact information. We ask you to please reach out for any questions or concerns you may have. I will now pass it to Paul. Thank you.
Thanks, Muna. We will be returning to that slide just for everyone. If you were quickly jotting that information down, that will be our last slide tonight. So you don't need to worry about that. It will be up again. So if you can just turn the slide back, please, Nick, that would be great. For tonight, we're going to spend a lot of time really digging into culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy, CRRP. And a huge thank you to Saja and Connie for spending this time and digging into it and explaining what it is and why it's relevant and why it sews the work together that we've just outlined to you. We wanted to give you an introduction to the CRRP. It is one of our major focuses as an equity department, really influencing and supporting the work of schools, really supporting the change within classrooms, allowing students to see themselves reflected within the curriculum, celebrating diversity, celebrating diverse identities. And all schools have started this learning journey about CRRP. I outlined that we began that initial step for all schools on March the 4th. Although we've been talking about CRRP for a number of months now as a whole system. There have been a number of schools that have been engaged in CRRP work for the last few years, and learning and diving into this work as well, and through the leadership of Saja and Connie. We'll be continuing this ongoing implementation throughout HWDSB throughout this year and throughout future years, as this is an important aspect of students seeing themselves reflected in HWDSB, within their classrooms, within the materials that they come in contact with every day. I'm excited to turn it to Saja and Connie, and we'll be spending a good amount of time here around CRRP.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Saja Stiller, pronouns she, her, and I am the Safe Schools and Racial Equity Consultant for the board. I am really excited to be bringing this presentation to you and to share some of the work that we've been doing. I've been connected to the Equity and Wellbeing Department for a number of years, and I've had the pleasure of seeing firsthand how this work has grown and changed and influenced the lives and the trajectories of students in our classrooms. I want to begin by just helping you understand the CRRP as a pedagogical tool. And what you'll see on the slide is a large body of evidence that CRRP draws from. CRRP is an evidence-based pedagogical tool. What you see here is not an exhaustive list, but it highlights some of the key work that informs culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. You may be familiar with some of the researchers or the ideas connected to early work in CRRP. For example, if we look at critical pedagogy, the work of Paulo Freire, you may be familiar with his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and that is some of the beginning work that informs CRP going back almost 45 years now. Equity pedagogy, the work of James Banks. You may be familiar with some of the language around identifying bias and prejudice in tools, in books, and the James Banks model. And then also, right at the bottom there, constructivism, Piaget's work that That's the early work, and it was further developed by Villegas and Lucas in the cultural context to help bring constructivism, which is building of shared knowledge and ideas together, and students and educators co-learning into a cultural context. Foundational to CRRP is the ongoing work of Gloria Ladson-Billings. And some of us within the equity department had the pleasure of hearing her speak firsthand in some of the trainings that we've had the opportunity to participate in. Gloria Ladson-Billings' work drew from supports for Black students in an American context, but then really broadened across the world. Ladson-Billings coined the term culturally relevant pedagogy. And then looking over to the right, the term culturally responsive teaching, as developed by researcher Geneva Gay, is also foundational. Now, more recently, Nicole West-Burns and Jeff Kugler, working out of Toronto, brought these two terms together to identify culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. They drew from the work of Ladson-Billings and Geneva Gay to create a new term and a new approach that brought together the best of both of these pedagogies. And then as well, culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, which Kugler and West-Burns brought together around 2012, 2013, has since developed since that time. At the bottom right, you'll see culturally sustaining pedagogy, the work of a researcher by the name of Django Paris. And Paris's work really looks at the idea that culture is not just something that's stagnant, but it continues to develop and grow. And when we think about our students, our children, and the generation and the things that they are growing up with, it may be quite different to our experiences. They are not just consumers of cultures, but they generate culture. Youth culture and a social media culture informed by youth is a part of the sustained cultural process. And so most important for our understanding around the pedagogy connected to culturally relevant and responsive teaching is that the bodies of knowledge are connected, they inform each other, and they are continually growing. Next slide, please, and I will pass it over to Connie.
Thank you so much, Saja, for giving us that background knowledge and setting the stage for why we are diving deeper into culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. So good evening, everyone. My name is Connie Sun. I am one of the K-12 program consultants with HWDSB. And it's been an honor to be deeply involved in this work and helping our educators and students to engage in this in this learning. So I want to speak generally first about on what is CRRP. So CRRP first and foremost recognizes the importance of including students' cultural references in all aspects of learning and well-being. So in other words, CRRP understands that each student's identity as a learner is complex. Each student carry their own values, their own beliefs and lived experiences, as well as general worldviews when they walk into our classrooms. And all of these factors influence their experiences and their achievement as a learner in our schools, as well as their well-being. CRRP insists that we start to understand that success for all students means embracing the cultural assets that they carry with them every day and refusing to let those assets remain at the door. CRRP seeks to educate the whole child and creates space in our learning environment for students to feel accepted, to know that what he, she, or they bring to the learning community is valuable and important. Next slide, please. An important distinction to note is that CRRP is not about cultural celebrations, nor is it aligned with traditional ideas around multiculturalism. So CRRP involves careful acknowledgement, respect, and an understanding of differences and its complexities. So we're going to dive into the idea of culture and the distinctions between CRRP and education in a moment. So within this pedagogical framework, so CRRP examines issues such as power and privilege, and it calls participants to challenge these beliefs and assumptions about the students in their class and explores on a very deep level what is necessary to enable all students to be successful in school. Next slide, please. So CRRP is not an off-the-shelf program. There isn't really a checklist of must-do assignments or must-read books. Therefore, it's not an add-on to the existing curriculum. It is not a quick fix for systemic barriers. Rather, CRRP is a mindset and a belief system that roots in a deep knowledge of who we are as educators, as people, our values, our beliefs, our position in society, and most importantly, as we take on our role as an educator, it seeks a deep knowledge in who our students are as learners and as people. And as I mentioned a moment ago, CRRP seeks to examine issues such as power and privilege, and calls learners to understand and challenge existing systemic barriers, so all students can be successful. And therefore, CRRP seeks to set high expectations for all students. CRRP is not simply about ethnicities or countries of origin. Rather, it stems from the belief that all learners are complex. Ethnicity is one part of a student's identity. All aspects of a student's identity is important and should be honored. So for example, identity markers including, but not limited to, and there's a list of examples here, sex, race, nationality, orientation, ethnicity, creed, gender, faith, socioeconomic status, and family structure. CRRP is not the same as multicultural education, which generally focuses on the 4 F's of culture: the food, the festival, the fun, and the folklore. As an example, a school may choose to celebrate Multicultural Day by encouraging students to bring in food items from their own culture or dress in their traditional attires. There's absolutely room for cultural celebrations and appreciation. However, CRRP seeks to move beyond the 4 F's of culture and engage students to have deeper understandings of culture. And we'll discuss a little bit more about what is culture later on. Okay, let's advance the slides, please. So we're going to take a closer look at CRRP as a pedagogy. And before I dive in, I just wanted to make a quick note in that even though our teachers and students are engaging in learning about this pedagogy, it is not the only pedagogy or the only tool that our educators are using. So for example, we are still designing learning experiences and activities through universal design for learning. We're still engaging in evidence-based reading strategies, just to name a few. So CRRP is just one pedagogy out of many that our educators are using. So in CRRP, there are 3 central tenets. and one of them is setting high academic expectations. So let's advance the slide. So under this pedagogy, high academic standards are set for all students. And we do that by first fostering a caring relationship and positive attitudes in the classroom and school community. And the goal is to create an environment that promotes a positive academic mindset. Students would feel that they belong to this learning community, not only coming to school for a social community, but an intellectual community, that students believe that they can succeed in school, and that the learning they're engaged in has value and relevance in their lives. As an analogy, an analogy that I like to use is that all students are climbing a mountain with the goal to reach the top. So some of our students may need walking sticks, some need to take frequent breaks, some may need words of encouragement, some may need well-constructed stairs, and some may need accessible ramps, a map perhaps, and so on. So CRRP recognizes that each student enters the classroom with different needs, and we support students' academic pursuits through differentiation. So educators adapt the way they teach to meet students' needs. When we do that through offering scaffolding in the classroom, offering support when needed, and as well as using a variety of assessment tools, which allows students to demonstrate what they know in a variety of ways. We offer social emotional support, just to name a few. CRRP strongly believes that students, their families, and community are an important contributor in setting high academic expectations and helping students achieve high expectations, that it is a partnership with students' families and community. And lastly, CRRP takes an asset approach with students. So for example, instead of questioning, why isn't a student reading at grade level? Or this student has so many gaps and isn't achieving at grade level, we seek to approach students and their learning and achievement from an asset-based lens. We ask questions such as, what are some strengths in the student's learning? What is the student's next step, and how can we support them to get there? All right, let's advance the slide. So the next central tenet in CRRP is cultural competence. So as we begin to discuss our discussion around building cultural competence, I ask you in the audience today to just take a moment to think about what comes to mind when you think about culture. So if someone were to ask you, what is culture? What are some of the things that come to mind? So I'll pause for a moment. So oftentimes when we think about culture, we think about things such as how we dress, the languages that we speak, the food that we eat, holidays we celebrate, our religious beliefs, and so on. Next slide, please. Can we go one slide back? Let me see. Oh, actually, sorry, I'm looking at the slide order. So let's advance to slide 24 first. Thank you so much for that. So when we think about culture, so here is a visual representation to help us understand the concept of culture. So the visual here selected is we think of culture like an iceberg. So there is the visible part at the top, and the largely invisible parts moving toward the bottom. So the visible part, or what we call surface culture, are parts of culture we can easily see, including clothing, music, arts and crafts, language, games, and celebration. So at this level of culture carries a relatively low emotional charge. For most of the time, it's easy to talk about what languages we speak and which holidays we celebrate. And earlier this evening, we briefly talked about the differences between CRRP and multicultural education. So multicultural education largely remains at this level of culture. Is it important? Absolutely. But there's more to what makes a culture than just what's on the surface. So as we move down below the surface, we begin to dive into what's known as shallow culture. So over here, most of the unspoken cultural rules and social norms that dictates how we should act. So for example, our concept of time. So when we say a 9 a.m. start, do we start school and work right at 9 a.m.? Or do we have a more relaxed understanding of a starting time? Eye contact is another cultural norm, as well as body language as additional examples. So as a collective, as a culture, do we expect others to maintain eye contact when we converse? And how do we interpret the other person if there isn't eye contact? So when these unspoken, shallow cultural social norms are broken, it can lead to distrust. So moving further down, the unconscious rules and our belief system reside here in deep culture. So this level of culture include concepts such as who we are as people, our worldviews, religious beliefs, what is right or wrong, and so on. And beliefs held in deep culture carries very intense emotional charge, and beliefs here are much more difficult to shift. So let's advance to the next slide. So here is just another graphic to represent culture. So in this graphic, it also has the surface culture, the shallow culture, and the deep culture being represented in the image of a tree. So the idea is that what we can see on the surface level, we talked about the 4 Fs, the music, the food, the hairstyle, cooking, drama, literature, stories, all of the things that we can see that carries lower emotional charge are represented by the leaves and the fruits of the tree, and then the unspoken cultural norms are represented by the trunks of the tree as we move a little bit down. So that's the shallow culture, and deep in the roots of the tree are the deep culture collective unconscious beliefs and norms that we hold. So things like spirituality, concept of self, how we make decisions, our worldviews. So I would like to also mention that in this representation of our understanding of culture, it's also understood that a tree does not exist by itself. We find a tree most often amongst a forest, so that so then a culture does not exist in isolation. That it is always part of a collective. That it is a part of an ecosystem, and that many factors would influence the way that we think, what we believe, and outside external factors will influence what goes down in the roots of the tree, which then eventually will manifest in the leaves and the fruits. So that there is that interconnected. Let's go back to slide 23. Thank you. So in order to build a strong cultural competence in the classroom, not only will students value their own culture, but an inclusive classroom encourages students to learn about the cultures of others who may or may not be represented in the classroom. So CRRP aims to honor students' social identities, and as well, CRRP values students' lived experience and prior knowledge as an asset that not only shapes who they are as people, but also contribute to the collective knowledge in the classroom community. And within this classroom community, educators are not experts on all different cultures, but are co-learners and active participants. Having strong cultural competence does not mean that educators and students will navigate 25 different sets of visible culture. For example, learning how to say hello in 25 different languages as one example, but rather it calls educators and students to approach one another with curiosity and openness, and ultimately to build strong relationships based on respect and empathy. And it holds the belief that students are not only consumers of culture, but also creators of culture. So for example, youths create culture all the time. If we think about our world continuously moving toward that trend of self-media on YouTube, TikTok, memes, just to name a few. So youths play an active role in creating culture. So in a classroom with strong cultural competence, educators and students are invited to co-construct norms and build a classroom culture that allows all participants to learn and also thrive. All right, let's advance to slide 26. All right. So the last central tenet in CRRP is building critical consciousness. And next slide, please. To build strong critical consciousness, we first acknowledge that there are social inequities for different groups based on power, privilege, oppression, social position, and many other factors. CRRP seeks to name challenges and barriers that exist in society and challenge students to not only understand these concepts, but then to question, to analyze, and critique, so that students will have that foundational knowledge and vocabulary to be able to be well-versed and equipped to critically interrogate and disrupt materials or information presented to them. CRRP aims to build skills in how to think and not what to think. So next, I will invite my colleague Saja Stiller to come forward again to share one resource our educators have been using to support culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy.
Thank you so much, Connie. I'm really excited to talk to you about a resource, a tool that we have for educators across our board from kindergarten right through to grade 12 called Learn, Disrupt, Rebuild at HWDSB, Building a Community of Care. Now, just to help you connect it to some of the things that have been previously shared, Learn, Disrupt, Rebuild aligns with the Equity Action Plan in that it is a resource grounded in CRRP. And one of the goals of our Equity Action Plan is related to school and classroom practices to develop and integrate culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy approaches to promote teaching, curriculum, and assessment that are responsive to students' needs and lived experiences. I wanted to share with you that earlier today, I had the opportunity to attend a ministry session to share Learn, Disrupt, Rebuild and some of our board's work. The ministry conversation and support for CRRP began almost 5 years ago. The pedagogy itself is much older, but 5 years ago, there was a concerted effort by the Ministry of Education and the Equity Education Secretariat to bring culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy as a tool to boards. And it is just this year that they have been able to achieve working and helping all boards across the province do explore CRRP. It's an exciting venture because CRRP really does help center the voices of students and families who have been historically and currently marginalized or erased from education. The ministry supports this tool and is bringing it to boards across the province. And so it was a great opportunity this morning to be in conversation with representatives from across the province, sharing what they've done with culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. Moving to the next slide, please. The work began back in around 2020 to develop Learn, Disrupt, Rebuild to address the return to school following the first extended lockdown during the pandemic. And really, this work has continued since that time. Learn, Disrupt, Rebuild as a resource was created by a team of 12 elementary and secondary educators, many of which had lived experience connected to the issues that are being addressed within the resource. The lessons in Learn, Disrupt, Rebuild at HWDSB are intended to support staff and students as they address issues related to human rights, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, anti-oppression, mental health, and well-being. The resource was developed with ongoing support from community partners. And it is also a living document that we continue to refine and add to as time goes on. Next slide, please. So all the lessons in Learn, Disrupt, Rebuild align with the overall expectations in the Ontario curriculum across varying subject areas. The resource supports kindergarten right through to grade 12. So while the ministry sets out the curriculum, Learn, Disrupt, Rebuild is a tool or resource that connects to the curriculum and helps educators achieve the expectations within it from a culturally relevant and responsive stance. All of the lessons in Learn, Disrupt, Rebuild are designed to build educator and student capacity in the 3 tenets, which Connie outlined earlier. High expectations for all students, cultural competence, and critical consciousness. Next slide, please. The lessons in this resource are organized by division. So primary, that would be kindergarten to grade 3, junior, grades 4 through to 6, intermediate, grades 7 and 8, and secondary, grades 9 through to 12. They're also grouped into 4 modules. And each of these modules was introduced over time, beginning in the fall of 2020 and continuing on into this year. Module 1 focused on physical safety, mental health, and wellness. When we returned from our first quarantine period to school in September, we needed to implement learning and support students as they adjusted to physical distancing, hand washing, and the routines connected to keeping ourselves safe at school. And we also needed to address and give space for students to acknowledge the feelings and emotions connected to being in lockdown and being separate from their peers, their friends, their teachers, their family members. So Module 1 lessons connected to that. Module 2 focused on understanding identity and intersectionality. Now these topics are complex, so they are broken down and addressed in age-appropriate ways, and the knowledge builds over time, knowing that a student may look at identity in grade 1 and connect it to race, and then build on that as they move through the grades, because this resource, like we said, is ongoing. Module 3 explored topics in human rights, understanding human rights, equity, and anti-racism. And then finally, Module 4 focused on helping educators and students move towards action and allyship in support of others. Next slide, please. So the overall goal of Learn, Disrupt, Rebuild at HWDSB is to create change through active allyship, communicating and interacting with empathy, all of which align with culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. The lessons in this K-12 resource center both students and teachers as co-learners, as they develop a shared understanding of relevant concepts within a caring community of learners. Together, students and educators will learn, disrupt, and rebuild. But what do we mean when we say that? What are we asking students and educators to do? Well, on the screen, you'll see the student-friendly language. When we say learn, we mean that students know who I am is important for my well-being and learning. Their identities matter. Their cultures matter. Their thoughts and ideas matter, and they are invited and welcomed into the educational space. When we say disrupt, students would say it as I notice and name things that are unfair for myself and for others. This is why the understanding of identity and culture is so important, because our lived experiences are so unique. We may not recognize, based on our experience, that something is unfair, but as we engage in dialogue with others, we will notice and name things that are unfair for them and work towards understanding and empathizing when we notice these things. And then finally, rebuild. Students would say, I am an ally in progress, because allyship is an action, not a destination. It's ongoing. I work to create a safer and fair learning experience for everyone. We know historically and even currently, our learners, some of our learners have been excluded or have disparate outcomes in education. They don't graduate at the same rates. They don't have the same successes or opportunities as some of their counterparts, based on the identities that they inhabit, based on sometimes the skills that they have or do not have. And so when we say rebuild, we want to think about those students. And this is connected directly to the populations identified in our annual plan. For example, Black students, Indigenous students, racialized students, those students who are two-spirit, those individuals who identify as LGBTQIA+, also students who require special education supports. These are all the populations that we're focused on to create safer and fair learning experience. And as we do that for those who have been historically marginalized, we actually create better outcomes for everyone, because we change the systemic inequities and open up access. Moving to the next slide, please. So how can you support your child within Learn, Disrupt, Rebuild and with culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy? Well, first of all, a simple one. Ask your child, do they recognize the logo that you see on the screen here? And hopefully they will. The resource has been available since the fall of 2020, so educators have access to it. Many times our children come home, and when we ask what they've learned at school, they say nothing. Or, what'd you do? I don't know. So show them the logo and ask them if they recognize this. And then if they do, you can ask which lessons or topics they have discussed related to Learn, Disrupt, Rebuild. Another aspect that we acknowledge is that learning about culture, identity, intersectionality is complex. And so we want you to talk with your child about this learning, to keep the conversation open, and also to have a supportive stance. So simple questions that you could also ask are, what did you learn about today? What did you think about what you learned today? And do you have any questions about this topic? We want all parents, caregivers, families to know that you can reach out to your child's classroom teacher to find out more about how they are implementing Learn, Disrupt, Rebuild and culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy. Each educator is using the tool to help meet the needs of the learners in their class, and it's going to be a unique approach. It might not look the same in every classroom. And finally, you can encourage your child to apply their learning to their daily lives, make connections by asking questions, getting involved in allyship and community. Next slide, please. So at this time, we invite questions. And please note that the questions are relevant to tonight's presentation connected to culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, as well as Learn, Disrupt, Rebuild. Happy to speak more about other topics at a different time. Please use the Q&A to ask your questions.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm going to read a few of the published questions here. So the first question, when classes have 30 or more students in a class, how do teachers achieve CRRP with individual students?
Thank you for the question. CRRP is not about achieving something specific with an individual student, although it does address individual student needs. It's really about building collective understanding. So teachers would be engaged in conversation, discussion, and learning to help students understand who they are as individuals, and also to share that with each other. The beautiful part is that it generates understanding and empathy. It also can generate a lot of excellent questions and opportunities for sharing at home, exploring who they are in connection to their families, their cultures, their languages, and their experiences. So rather than thinking of CRRP as something to achieve for individual students, think of it as allowing all students to enter the conversation, the educational space as their full selves, because the teacher is really intentional about taking the time to get to know the student and to help the students know about each other, and then grounding that in the context of the wider community and the world. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Saja. The next question here, so I'll read it out loud. So the Ontario Human Rights Commission report, Right to Read, concluded that an excessive focus on CRRP and ignoring science and evidence-based instruction is harmful to marginalized students. So why is HWDSB centering it, making it the core?
Thanks, Kim, and thanks for asking this question. The Ontario Human Rights Commission Right to Read report is a critical report that all boards throughout the province, including HWDSB, is reviewing, is implementing the recommendations. Currently, our Specialized Services Department, along with the Program Department, are moving forward on implementation of the recommendations and looking at practices that we already have, practices that we need to improve, and practices that we need to implement. I don't disagree with the statement in the sense of there needs to be evidence-based teaching of effective literacy and literacy achievement skills in order to read, in order to accomplish the goals set out in the Right to Read Commission report. What we're presenting tonight is not in lieu of, in co of. So we're not suggesting that CRRP is the pedagogy approach or the only pedagogy approach that we would be taking in planning and executing lessons around learning to read, developing critical literacy skills. However, when we're planning, we're considering, we're looking at the resources that we're using for students and what we're presenting to students under those essential literacy skills, those scientifically proven strategies around literacy development, such as phonics and those pieces, that we are looking through that with a CRRP lens, understanding the learners that are in front of us, and that we're supporting and thinking about their diverse identities within that. So I don't think we disagree on those points. We do believe that effective literacy instruction needs to happen in classrooms. We value the recommendations outlined in the Ontario Human Rights Right to Read report, and we are currently working hard to improve what we're doing. Again, look on what we need to add and what we need to improve on. However, what we are saying is it needs to be done in co. We need to understand the learners that are in front of us, and they should see themselves reflected within the curriculum under a CRRP lens in co. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Just bear with us as we sort through these questions.
Can I add?
Of course.
Okay, I'm not sure if everyone can see me, but I just wanted to add to Paul's idea by telling a bit of a story. So imagine a child in a grade 1 or 2 class who is a struggling reader. Maybe think about your own child and their journey with reading. Sometimes the barrier is that they haven't found the right fit book, or they haven't found the ideas or the topics that really engage them and make reading meaningful to them. Sometimes. It's not that CRRP is replacing sound reading pedagogy. It's adding to. For example, many of our Black and Indigenous students never see a book or a resource that reflects their lived identities. Our curriculum and many of the standard texts that have been designed over time are quite Eurocentric. It makes it difficult for children sometimes to buy in, to be excited about reading. Now flip it, when we use a CRRP approach and we bring in resources, ideas, structures from history and cultures that a child connects with, it can make the learning come alive and help them buy into reading and be able to employ those strategies. So the strategies are still there. The sound reading instruction is still there, but the tools to access the learning are grounded in the identity of the child. This is what we're trying to do through CRRP, to make things come alive for our Black, Indigenous, racialized students, for those students whose gender identities or sexual orientations are often erased from the educational space, for those students whose abilities are often erased from the educational space. I hope that helps clarify.
Thanks, Saja. So our next question here is about the Learn, Disrupt, Rebuild. Learn, Disrupt, Rebuild. So there are lessons missing from the Learn, Disrupt, Rebuild site on the HWDSB website, and we're just wondering, why is that?
So there are not lessons missing. Actually, there are some samples of lessons up there. The Learn, Disrupt, Rebuild, initially when it was in draft form and we were introducing it to our educational community and a number of different people, we had everything there. And since that time, we have just put samples because it's actually available to all educators on our board intranet, the full lessons, because the teacher lessons were what was up to give feedback. Now we just have examples of the lessons for parents, for any of the public to look at, but the actual lessons that include the curriculum connections and the steps for teachers to take are available, all of them, to the educators who are teaching the lessons.
Thanks, Michelle. So I have another question here. So one question is, how can you protect the identity of individuals who have human rights-based complaints within the board?
Hi, everyone. I'd be happy to answer that question. So I think for us, the important key points that we want to reiterate is that when a complaint or a concern is brought to the attention of the Human Rights Office, our number one step is impartiality. We also want to ensure that there's confidentiality throughout the entire process, whether it becomes an official complaint or simply a concern that has been brought to our attention. And then finally, another key important piece when addressing a concern is ensuring the timeliness of a process. So those three key points put together allow us to address an issue and resolve it in a way that is positive for all parties involved.
Thank you, Muna. So for the next question, we have someone asking for an example of what a systemic barrier is for a marginalized student.
Thanks, Kim, and I see Saja's jumped on, so maybe I'll start, and Saja, you can continue and support and deepen the answer. And thank you for that. And there are many systemic barriers that are in place for students, and there are many that we have identified and that we are addressing, and that there are many that are unknown to us in that students are facing, and that we continue to seek to learn about. And really, a systemic barriers is really anything in place that is going to put a student at a disadvantage, a barrier for them to access curriculum, a barrier for them to achieve and learn. So an example might be class reading materials and not seeing themselves within the curriculum, or not being presented with curriculum that students that are accessible for those students, or having to pay for experiences that they can't access in the same way, and it's maybe a year after year thing of going on this field trip in order to access the curriculum and learn in a really deep and meaningful way. Or we look at teaching students, Ramadan is approaching soon, and not giving proper religious accommodation, and not considering, the importance of this time for Muslim students, and not putting things in place for them to have appropriate religious accommodations. Saja, I'll turn to you, and if you want to add on those examples, that would be great.
Absolutely. You did a great job, though. So thank you, Paul. When we talk about systemic barriers, these barriers are obstacles, and they're self-perpetuating. And when I say that, I mean that the system itself, how it is set up, creates these barriers naturally. And so then we have to be intentional about disrupting them and changing the practice so that the barriers are not present for students. For example, Paul just spoke about Ramadan. The school calendar is set up in a way that centers the Christian faith. The timing of many of the school holidays, in particular their winter break, aligns with the Christmas holiday. If you are a part of a faith that is outside of that, your religious observances may fall on different dates, and may mean that you need to miss actual school days in order to participate in your religious observances. The Ontario Human Rights Code ensures that people don't have to choose, and so that their religious obligations and their right to education don't come into conflict. But our system as a school board is set up so that sometimes students do have to choose, because unless we're intentional about recognizing when Ramadan falls and planning exams, tests, special events to not disrupt that time, students do have to do some negotiating, and we are obligated to provide those religious accommodations as a school board. But as a classroom teacher, it is my responsibility to know and to make accommodations naturally for that, so that students don't have to put their hand up every time and say, oh, by the way, miss, I'm fasting. By the way, miss, I'm not going to be here because it's Eid tomorrow. So that's just one example, and it's connected to the school calendar, which is set out by, it's planned by the board, but set out by the ministry and approved by the ministry, and it does center one faith over others. That's one example of a systemic barrier. It's ongoing. That calendar really has not changed, and unless we as educators and as a school board start to examine that practice, we create barriers unintentionally for students. I hope that helps answer your question.
Thank you, Saja. The next question we have here is about disability. So you've barely mentioned disability, especially disabilities that directly impact learning. How is this not considered a barrier to learning? Is only race, ethnicity, or two-spirited LGBTQ factors considered within equity?
Thanks for that, Kim. And I can start this question and then turn it to Michelle. And I apologize to this to the individual that has put this question in, and that's definitely not our intention to ignore disability. And as we or students with special learning needs, the intentionality right from the beginning is honoring folks' human rights and anti-racism, anti-oppression, and thinking about marginalization. And we know that students that have special learning needs or identify as disabled are significantly marginalized, and we need to address this. We address this in many ways, and if we look through the Equity Action Plan that is located on our board site, it does include students with disabilities and considering removing systemic barriers for those students. Looking at how are we looking at inclusive and opening up curriculum access and barrier-free schools, ensuring that we're entering into this space. We're also looking at how are students succeeding that may have a learning disability, and how are we continuing to close the gaps and push pathways specifically for secondary, and not filtering folks into applied courses that are leading to a pathway that is not necessarily leading to university or college. So as a board, we are looking at disability at a multifaceted lens. So as an equity department and as human rights, we dig into understanding and asking questions about, in a very similar way to ways that we presented in CRRP, about folks with disabilities, with special learning needs, and how are we ensuring that we're removing barriers, setting high expectations, and they see themselves within the curriculum materials that we use, and really look at disability and disability pride. And from there, really also digging into our specialized services department with their plan around with equity as gap closing, and understanding the history of disability within Ontario, and the challenges and the barriers and the oppression that disabled folks have experienced. I'll turn it over to my partner Michelle, and she can fill in my some things that I've left out.
Thank you, Paul. I think that you have actually covered it quite well. So our Equity Action Plan does include addressing the needs of students who receive specialized services, as well as our English language learners and our learners who English is their second language. And I think that the Equity as Gap Closing Plan that's being put forth by Specialized Services really delves deeply into those pieces of equity that we would like to address with our students who receive specialized services. And so when talking about equity, and tonight talking about Learn, Disrupt, Rebuild, or CRRP, for those of us who work in the industry, we really probably didn't articulate well enough that there is the intersectional nature of some of the areas of equity that we look at, and so we make assumptions that we are talking about all different types of equity, but certainly special students who receive specialized services, as well as students with other needs or assets that we like to look at it as our English language learners have assets of, knowing more than one language, and so English is adding to their skill development. That is included in our Equity Action Plan, and certainly part of what CRRP addresses within classrooms, because that the foundation of that pedagogy is really looking at the needs of all students. the other thing that I want to bring up is the fact that I think somebody asked a question before about Learn, Disrupt, Rebuild. Is it being based on an American model? And Learn, Disrupt, Rebuild, I'm not sure if it was stated when Sasha talked about it, was actually written and developed by a group of HWDSB educators. And so Sasha Stiller being one of them, as well as Sharon, who's on the call helping now, and a number of other educators actually wrote the resource a few summers ago and developed it, as I said, with educators from HWDSB as well as people from the community. So it is not an American resource, it's an HWDSB created resource.
Thank you, Michelle. We have just a little bit of time left. I'm going to read one final question. What is the board's role in getting involved in resolving human rights complaints when all other venues within HWDSB have failed?
Hi, I'll quickly answer that question. The board's initial role is to find a mutually satisfactory resolution, an early resolution for all parties involved. In the event that that is not possible, there is always the opportunity and the right of the complainant to seek additional support and file a complaint with the Human Rights Tribunal. And that right is often reminded and notified to the complainant throughout the entire process. So at any point, a complainant has a right to seek additional support through the Human Rights Tribunal by filing out a claim.
So as we come to the 8 o'clock mark, and I know we have not hit all the questions, and we will try to continue to respond after this. There are 2 email addresses if your question wasn't answered that you can also send your questions to. I want a huge thank you to PIC for organizing this session. A huge thank you to all attendees that have come in and participated and listened and learned what we are doing with human rights and equity through HWDSB. I'd also like to thank the Equity and Human Rights Department's teams for coming together, creating this presentation for folks, and spending their time tonight with us and answering questions and doing some learning around human rights and equity. Also, thanks to our communications department, Nick, Sean, and Kim, for leading and supporting us technically and advertising this. And again, everyone for coming tonight. So a huge thank you and all the best to everyone, and we hope to come back and present at a later date.